Այժմին բացառիկյուրն է տարածաշրջանային հետազոտությունների կենտրոնի ղեկավար քաղաքական վերլուծաբան Richard Giragosian. Hi, Mr. Giragosian. Thanks for coming to our studio. I want to start my interview with a controversial statement by the Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko. In an interview with the chief Russian TV propagandist Vladimir Solovyov, Lukashenko said that Pashinyan understood that nobody cares about Armenia, that Armenia has nowhere to go and it is forced to join Union State. Despite everyone in Armenia condemned Lukashenko's statement, one has to be really worried that Russia has serious intentions, perhaps, on resurrecting reduced version of USSR. What do you think?
Actually, I don't share the concern. In many ways, President Lukashenko of Belarus has only made more enemies and lost potential allies. This is much less a reflection of Russian policy and much more a reflection of the desperation of the despot in Minsk, who, don't forget, is a close ally of the Azerbaijani leadership.
So you think this is not serious? There's nothing serious?
Well, the only serious thing is the future of Belarus. In many ways, that is the bigger picture and the buildup against Ukraine from Belarus, and much less any direct implication for Armenia, and little in terms of any impact on Armenian-Russian relations. This is why even Moscow has backed away from these so-called controversial statements.
Yeah, Richard, but I mean, this guy, when he talks something, he knows something, right? That, you know, it's in Putin's mind to somehow recreate some version of former Soviet Union in a rather loosely tied union. But he wants to have this former republics under his control. What do you think?
Well, that's in terms of Russian policy. Yes, I fully agree. But the Belarus statement is marginal. But if we do look at Russian influence and power in the so-called near abroad, Putin, in many ways, is pursuing his own spheres of influence, pushing back and pushing against the West. Fortunately for Armenia, which doesn't have a land border with Russia, we're smart enough not to seek NATO membership, nor even European Union membership. Armenia is in a more vulnerable position, but much less of a prize or target for the Kremlin.
So since we are talking about the Russia-Ukraine standoff and the possibility of imminent invasion to Ukraine by Russian forces, what can you tell us about the spillover effect of the conflict? Armenia will be in a very difficult, tough situation in case Moscow decides to initiate another CSTO operation in Ukraine, or if there is a vote at the United Nations, Armenia will be asked to vote in favor of Russia.
I disagree slightly for two reasons. One is Russian buildup and the threat of war against Ukraine is much more a bilateral conflict between Russia and Ukraine, between Russia and the West, and not the CSTO. Unlike Kazakhstan, Armenia would not be required to participate. However, the second factor is more important. Pressure from Russia, expectations on Armenia and its government going forward are actually already present. In many ways, the Armenian government offers a bigger prize for President Putin in Moscow. Unlike Lukashenko, a legitimate democratically elected government of Armenia represents a more valuable trophy in terms of Armenia becoming much more subordinate to Russia, dependent on Russian peacekeepers, protecting Nagorno-Karabakh, for example. And in this context, the underlying problems of Armenia's overdependence on Russia were already evident well before the buildup against Ukraine.
Now, I mean, I'm afraid of impact of in case war breaks and Western countries impose tough sanctions on Russia. This will have enormous negative effects on Armenia as well, on Armenian economy, right?
Yes,
and
I agree.
Imagine all these migrant workers in Russia. They will be laid out. They will lose their jobs. They will come back to Armenia. And, Russian market is the biggest for Armenia. Now, what will happen? So that's my concern. What do you think about this?
Well, yes, the indirect implications, especially in terms of economics and trade, are most serious. A threat to Armenia in terms of an imposition of greater Western sanctions on Russia will actually threaten to make Armenia and the South Caucasus subject to more pressure from Russia, where the region returns to an arena of competition between Russia and the West, where we will be damaged and harmed. The second element of the negative impact, however, is that the likelihood of renewed hostilities over Ukraine will actually end the shared objective of post-war stability between the West and Russia. In other words, in the event of war again in Ukraine, it would be ever harder for the EU and the West to work with Russia in post-war stability operations or to maintain stability in Nagorno-Karabakh, for example.
And it seems to me that although you think that it's not serious, but in his recent article, Putin is talking about Ukraine as not being a separate state, as being as not being separate nation. I mean, they're completely undermining identity of Ukrainian identity. And it seems to me that he's quite serious about retaking former Soviet republics. Under his umbrella, it's a Russian umbrella, which he called Union State. I mean, he's pretty serious about that, Richard.
I agree.
Perhaps
I
we have
agree.
to think about.
And in fact, the real threat is the broader question. Independence and sovereignty of Armenia or any other former Soviet republic seems now to be a challenge to Putin's vision of recreating his sphere of influence. And also, there's no accident this comes after the quick and fairly easy success Russia had in Kazakhstan.
You say Kazakhstan. What about Nagorno-Karabakh? What about Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict? So, I mean, they got another easy victory in our region, right? And they have...
Well, not just an easy victory. It was Russia, even more than Azerbaijan and Turkey, that came out of the war for Nagorno-Karabakh as the sole winner. And in this context, our position in Armenia and in Stepanakert has changed. The future and current security and safety of the Armenians who remain in Nagorno-Karabakh are now dependent on Moscow, not Yerevan or Stepanakert. And this gives them even greater influence, especially given the necessity that the peacekeepers stay on the ground to prevent further attacks from Azerbaijan. Many
people think that it's Nagorno-Karabakh is gone. I mean, they are now Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh is under the control of Russians now. I mean, you call it the Russian peacekeeping mission or whatever. This Nagorno-Karabakh is being more frequently discussed in Russia's Security Council than in Armenia. So what's your take on that?
Well, that's the reality. In other words, we have to adjust to the new reality. We don't yet, in my opinion, have a coherent or clear strategy. But at the same time, this is why what's left of Nagorno-Karabakh is both now dependent on the Russian presence, but also, ironically, it's an incomplete victory for Azerbaijan. And the outcome of the war may actually sow the seeds for the implosion of today's Azerbaijan in terms of the father-to-son dynasty in Azerbaijan has much less of an excuse or justification for family corruption and no democracy, given the outcome. And at the same time, the Azerbaijanis didn't win enough, and the presence of the Russian peacekeepers prevents Azerbaijan from actually a true victory.
Yeah, but there is another angle in all this. For example, now European Union and the United States are warming up towards Azerbaijan, given the fact that if war breaks, Russian gas supplies will stop, and Azerbaijan will be the very important source of energy supplies to Europe, and therefore they will be closing eyes on many things in what's happening in Azerbaijan. What do you think?
I think it's too little too late. In other words, the future of Azerbaijan depends much less on external support or external pressure. The real outlook for instability in Azerbaijan is determined by the nature of the regime within Azerbaijan itself. And that's the real weakness, where a father-to-son Shakespearean dynasty that has ruled the country for over a quarter of a century is now dangerously balanced and caught between Turkey and Russia. Aliyev in Baku is riding a dangerous tiger, where in many ways they are increasingly isolated.
There's this theory that Father Aliyev was claiming that Turkish government wanted to assassinate him, and that's a history, that experience that Azerbaijan had before, right? And we don't know what's going to happen in this relationship, but it seems to me that the ties between Azerbaijan and Turkey is as close as never before. So, and in this regard, I think Azerbaijan has very big supporter in the region, and it doesn't depend on Russia, or, it can withstand any Russian pressure.
But that's my point. In other words, that emerging close relationship between Azerbaijan and Turkey is a challenge to Russian interests. And in this context, Aliyev could be vulnerable to a competition between the Turks and the Russians on the ground within Azerbaijan. And that's a recipe for instability. In contrast, if we look at Armenia, with a second back-to-back free and fair election in June 2021, we survived the most serious test to the country's stability and survival. Armenia has a much greater degree of resiliency, despite everything.
Now let's talk about the Armenian-Turkish normalization process. Both envoys, Serdar Kilic and Ruben Rubinian, met already in Moscow last month, and they will meet again later this month in Vienna. First of all, how good are these talks, and how sincere are Turks when they say they want to normalize relations with Armenia?
I'm glad you opened with this question, because in general, we've heard a lot of discussion over Armenia-Turkey normalization. But there are two key points that people forget. First is, Armenia-Turkey normalization represents addressing a failed Turkish policy. It was Turkish policy to deny diplomatic relations and keep the border closed. That did not result in any concessions from Armenia. Moreover, it was a failed policy. Secondly, your point is essential in terms of the burden, the test, and the challenge for the outcome of normalization is limited to the Turkish side only. Armenia has a policy of no preconditions. It's Turkey's burden of responsibility to prove their sincerity and to make this work. And if they impose any last-minute preconditions, or if Azerbaijan changes its position, it's not Armenia that will suffer. It would be the end of a Turkish diplomatic opportunity.
The Armenian foreign minister said that he hopes the second round of talks will be about substantive issues, such as the opening of Armenian-Turkish border. Is that a realistic expectations?
I think it's not only realistic, but it's an expectation that's the basic minimum. In other words, Turkey is a neighbor of Armenia, whether we like it or not. In this context, reopening the border, diplomatic relations, this is the bare minimum of relations between neighbors. It is not a reward to Turkey for fulfilling normalization, nor is it a defeat for Armenia. It's the basic minimum. In this context, normalization is not reconciliation, nor should it be seen as any kind of rapprochement. This is the starting point. Secondly, if we look closer at the course of diplomacy, the first meeting in Moscow was significant for two reasons. First, the venue, the location of starting in Moscow was very important to bring in the Russians as a stakeholder in the process from the very beginning. Second, having it in Moscow also got it out of the way. Now we're moving closer to the region. The next meeting in Vienna, with eventual meetings planned for both within Turkey and within Armenia itself. This is where it belongs, back in the region. But again, the Armenian foreign minister said nothing in terms of a breakthrough, nor anything particularly significant. Turkey, and mainly only Turkey, has a burden of responsibility to move to begin to reopen the border and reestablish diplomatic relations. From an Armenian side, we're willing to engage diplomatically, but it's also waiting for proof of life, proof of sincerity by the Turkish interlocutors.
Are Americans involved in this process? If the answer is yes, in what way they are involved? We know that Russians are also behind this and supporting the talks. At least they claim they are. How is it possible that two arch rivals in the geopolitics of the region of Eastern Europe could possibly be on the same page on Armenian-Turkish issues?
Well, I would argue what makes this second round of diplomatic re-engagement between Armenia and Turkey much more practical, much more realistic than the protocol process is the fact that, unlike 2008, 2009, when we required Swiss mediation, this time Armenia and Turkey do not need or require babysitters to hold our hands. This is direct negotiations. The United States, even the European Union, are not directly engaged. They're not pushing this as an agenda forced on Turkey or Armenia. And even Russian support and facilitation is based on the fact that it's Russian-owned sectors of the Armenian economy that will benefit from a reopening of the border. It's Russian border guards on that border. In other words, Russia has much more to gain and little risk of losing Armenia, whereas the US and the EU are not directly involved, which makes this much more possible and realistic.
Now let's talk about Armenian and Azerbaijani issues. Two countries continued talks earlier this week with the mediation of Macron and Charles Michel. How different are these talks from the talks mediated by Moscow? What do you know about that?
Well, my only observation is not the difference but the similarity. Both the Russian-mediated process of talks and the European Union's similarity, frustration. Azerbaijan is still following a diplomatic strategy that's neither diplomatic nor strategic. Armenian prisoners of war and detainees have become commodities in the transactional approach by Azerbaijan to gain concessions. And even the breakthrough agreement over railway access from Azerbaijan to Nakhichevan has been undermined by last-minute Azerbaijani demands. And there is little in terms of a spirit of goodwill in terms of either the European or Russian brokered talks. Hence the delay in border demarcation, which is also a pressing issue. And I think Azerbaijan is still a little bit dangerously drunk with victory.
And now Pashinyan said that Armenia is ready to start building communication lines and transportation once border issues are solved. And he said Armenia is interested in this project as much as Azerbaijan. He believes that it will be beneficial for all sides. Would you elaborate on what Armenia can expect from rebuilding communication lines with the neighbors and reopening the country to the outside world? the country was in a blockade for almost 30 years, isn't it the case? What can we expect, Richard?
Well, on the one hand, while I agree with Prime Minister Pashinyan's statement, I have an inability, an incapacity to elaborate very much because it's the details that matter much more than the general hopes and aspirations. What we can say, however, is this is very much a Russian-managed project for the regional restoration of trade and transport. In general, Armenia does have an opportunity to become more of a transit state. And the reason I'm strategically in favor of such a restoration of trade and transport is for Armenian national security. We need a missing ingredient, and that is deterrence. We need to use economic and trade interdependence as the new deterrence to prevent renewed attacks by Azerbaijan. Post-war stability is best served by Azerbaijan and Turkey being more dependent on routes through Armenia, on a reopening of the borders, trade and economic interdependence, where there will be a new deterrence, a new price to pay by Turkey and Azerbaijan in the event of the threat of war.
And Richard, one question. There are a lot of critics who are criticizing Pashinyan for his easygoing policy with Turkey, and they think that he's selling out Armenian interests, that he's ready to recognize, Turkish sovereignty. I mean, not sovereignty, but the borders. And there are a lot of controversial issues that the diaspora is not happy with. So, on the other hand, we know that these last elections actually gave him the mandate, which he claims that it is the mandate for peace. It is the mandate for reopening, borders, restarting relations with the neighbors. What do you think about this?
Well, in general, it's difficult to argue against the idea of normalizing relations, reopening borders, without knowing the details. In other words, accusations of capitulation, treason, etc. I understand the emotional political context, but I don't see any evidence of any concession yet. In other words, let's not get carried away. If anything, the opposition within Armenia is even more discredited and marginalized. They're good at opposing, but they're failing to propose any alternative of their own. Moreover, I think it's too premature to judge either a success or complete failure for this strategy. But again, we do have to balance the post-war reality versus Armenia's need for a strategic vision, which until now is still non-clarified. In other words, Armenia and its government need to do a much better job at communicating end-state objectives and its own diplomatic strategy.
I was just talking to Tom DeWall, and I asked the question, what is your advice to Armenian, if you were invited to be part of this negotiating team, what would be your advice for Armenians? How should they proceed? He said, not to be in a hurry. So what's your advice?
Well, in general, yes, not to be in a hurry, but it's also based on the real challenge and burden is on Turkey, and in many ways on Azerbaijan. Armenia survived the ultimate test. If anything else, and if nothing else, Armenia is a nation of survivors, and we've overcome the most existential threat to our very existence. What we see going forward is Armenia, and only Armenia, is much more stable, much more resilient than either Turkey or Azerbaijan. And we need to actually heighten that contrast. This is why much more attention to the institutionalization of democracy in Armenia is now the next step, and an end to vendetta politics.
Richard, we know that after Erdogan's crackdown, after the coup attempt, he jailed many opposition members, and jailed a lot of journalists, and the Turkish society was sort of silent about the Armenian genocide issue. It wasn't discussed at all. So we know that just before that, there was pretty good chance that both societies, both members of Turkish and Armenian societies, could one day, engage in discussing these tough issues. Now, but it seems to me that after Turkish society is now suppressed somehow, and what do you think? Is that possible that one day again these opportunities will open up for Turkish progressives to start talking about the Armenian genocide and and reconciling with Armenia? And what do you think?
Well, yes, because my approach to Armenia-Turkey normalization is based on much more self-confidence than much of our debate captures in Armenia. In other words, we should have much less doubt and understand we hold the moral high ground. Turkey's denial of the Armenian genocide is counterproductive to Turkey. They're increasingly isolated, whether it's President Biden's statement last April 24th or general directions in scholarly research. It's Turkey that is seeking normalization with Armenia because it's in an untenable, unsustainable situation. And despite the jailing of good friends like Osman Kavala, dedicated to peace and normalization, we also see the courage and bravery of my friend Garo Palyan, a member of the Turkish parliament, who actually is the most effective advocate for Turkey to more sincerely deal with and address the painful history that Turkey seeks to deny officially.
So what's your conclusion? Do you think that we will succeed in getting these at least first steps done, or what do you think?
Well, this is...
Would you foresee opening the Turkish-Armenian border or not?
Well, the clear answer is yes. In other words, the objectives for normalization are both practical and realistic, but they're also basic minimums. Establishing diplomatic relations and Turkey's reopening of the border. My point here is the success of normalization is the starting point. It's not the end conclusion. Turkey should not be overly praised or rewarded for starting with what's required of neighbors. Moreover, this is not yet reconciliation, and that's where the genocide issue comes up. But I do think there is new political will and a diplomatic opportunity to normalize relations by the coming year.
Thank you very much, Richard. It was very interesting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.